The woman on the television screen smiled as if she had never lost a thing. The host called her one of the most inspiring entrepreneurs in America, and the audience erupted into applause. But 5 years earlier, Rachel Carter had stood in a courthouse hallway with $300 in her purse and a life that looked completely over. Brandon Carter almost dropped the remote. The ice in his glass stopped rattling. Across the bright studio set, beneath the warm lights and polished cameras, Rachel looked nothing like the woman he remembered. Her posture was different. Her eyes were different. Even her smile carried a quiet certainty he had never seen before. On the screen behind her flashed images of food trucks, crowded city streets, smiling customers, and a growing restaurant brand that now stretched across 3 states. The host leaned forward in his chair. "Rachel, millions of people know your success story now, but very few know how it actually started." Rachel laughed softly. Not the nervous laugh Brandon remembered from their marriage. This one came from somewhere deeper, somewhere stronger. "It started with $300, she said. The audience murmured. Brandon felt something tighten in his chest. $300. He remembered that number. He remembered it because it was all she had left. The television light flickered across the living room walls. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. His girlfriend sat beside him scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention. But Brandon couldn't look away. Rachel continued speaking. "At the time, I thought my life was over." The camera slowly pushed closer to her face. "I was wrong." The audience applauded again. Brandon muted the television. Suddenly the room felt too small, too warm. His gaze remained fixed on the screen as memories he had spent years avoiding rose to the surface. 5 years earlier, family court had smelled faintly of old paper, burnt coffee, and polished wood. Rachel sat alone on a hard bench outside the courtroom, clutching a worn leather purse against her chest. The divorce had been finalized less than 20 minutes earlier. Around her, lawyers hurried through hallways carrying folders and briefcases. Families passed by discussing schedules, payments, and custody arrangements. Life continued moving for everyone except her. She stared at the floor. The polished tiles reflected the fluorescent lights above, creating a cold glow that made everything feel unreal. Her attorney had already left for another case. The courthouse was emptying around her. In her purse sat exactly $300. 3 crisp $100 bills. That was all. Brandon had kept the house. He had kept the SUV. He had secured primary custody of the children. The judge had signed the papers. The decisions were final. Rachel still remembered the sound of the gavel. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small sound that somehow managed to echo through her entire future. She rose slowly from the bench and walked toward the exit. Outside, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot. Cars came and went. Engines hummed. People returned to their lives. Rachel stood alone beneath the courthouse steps and looked at the contents of her purse. $300. A driver's license. An expired rewards card from a grocery store. A faded photo of her children smiling at the beach. Her fingers paused on the photograph. Emma's front tooth had been missing that summer. Caleb had insisted on building the world's worst sandcastle. Rachel smiled despite herself. Then the smile disappeared. The wind carried the scent of food from a nearby street vendor. Her stomach growled. She realized she hadn't eaten all day. Across the street, beyond a chain-link fence bordering an old industrial lot, something caught her attention. A battered food truck sat parked among rusted equipment and faded storage containers. Its paint was peeling. One tire looked nearly flat. The side panel carried the ghost of an old business logo barely visible beneath years of sun and weather. Most people would have seen junk. Rachel couldn't stop staring. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt herself take a step closer. Then another. And for the first time since leaving the courtroom, something stirred beneath the grief, the fear, and the exhaustion. Not hope. Not yet. Just a question. A dangerous little question that would change everything. What if this wasn't the end? The chain-link fence rattled softly in the evening breeze as Rachel stepped closer to the abandoned truck. Up close, it looked even worse. Rust stained the wheel wells. The serving window hung slightly crooked. Years of rain and sunlight had stripped away most of the paint, leaving behind faded patches of white and blue. A handwritten sign rested against the windshield. For sale. Call for details. Rachel stared at the phone number for several seconds. Her practical side immediately listed every reason it was a terrible idea. She had no business experience, no savings, no investors, no safety net. She had exactly $300 and nowhere near enough confidence to start a company. Yet something about the truck refused to let her walk away. Maybe it was because she had already lost everything worth losing. Maybe failure did not seem quite as frightening anymore. That night, she rented the cheapest motel room she could find on the edge of town. The carpet smelled faintly of bleach and old air conditioning. Outside, traffic drifted past on the highway. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed with her purse beside her and the photograph of Emma and Caleb in her hands. She missed them so much it physically hurt. The silence felt wrong without their laughter. She thought about calling Brandon, but she knew the children were already asleep. Instead, she placed the photo on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling. Sleep never came easily. Before sunrise, she was back at the industrial lot. The owner of the truck turned out to be a retired mechanic named Walter Simmons. He arrived carrying a paper cup of coffee and looked surprised that anyone had shown interest. He walked her around the vehicle while explaining every flaw in painful detail. The engine was old. The refrigeration unit barely worked. Several permits had expired years ago. The truck needed repairs. It needed cleaning. It needed almost everything. Rachel listened carefully. Then she asked the price. Walter named a number far beyond what she could afford. Her heart sank. She thanked him for his time and turned to leave. Halfway to the fence, she heard him call after her. "How much do you have?" Rachel hesitated before answering. $300. Walter studied her for a long moment. His weathered face revealed nothing. Finally, he nodded toward the truck. "You know, most people who come here see a broken vehicle." Rachel looked back at the rusted frame. "What do you see?" Walter asked. She swallowed. The answer surprised even her. "A second chance." The old mechanic smiled faintly. For the first time all morning, Rachel felt something warm push through the fear inside her chest. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys. Then maybe somebody ought to give it one. Rachel stared at the keys resting in his palm, hardly believing what she was seeing. And just like that, the direction of her entire life began to change. The keys felt heavier than they should have as Rachel carried them back to the motel. They were scratched, worn smooth by years of use, and attached to a faded plastic tag with no writing left on it. She placed them on the small table beside the bed and stared at them for nearly an hour. Every time reality began to settle in, a new wave of doubt followed. By morning, she was standing beside the truck again, armed with a bucket, cleaning supplies, and determination she was not entirely sure she possessed. The first day was brutal. Dust coated every surface. Old grease clung stubbornly to metal counters. Spiderwebs hid inside forgotten corners. By noon, her arms ached. Her shirt was soaked with sweat, and she wondered whether she had made a terrible mistake. Yet every hour she spent cleaning revealed something new beneath the neglect. The stainless steel prep station still shined once polished. The serving window opened smoothly after a little effort. Even the faded exterior seemed less hopeless when years of dirt disappeared beneath soap and water. Walter stopped by several times throughout the week. Sometimes he brought tools, sometimes advice, sometimes nothing more than encouragement and a fresh cup of coffee. Rachel quickly learned that rebuilding the truck was only part of the challenge. The paperwork seemed endless. Permits, health inspections, business licenses, insurance forms. Every office required another document she did not yet have. Every phone call seemed to create 3 more tasks. More than once she sat alone inside the truck long after sunset, wondering if she should quit before she embarrassed herself further. But every time she considered walking away, she looked at the photograph taped beside the driver's seat. Emma and Caleb smiled back at her from a summer that now felt impossibly distant. They became her reason to keep moving. 2 weeks later, Rachel stood in the narrow kitchen area holding a legal pad filled with ideas. Fancy menus were impossible. Expensive ingredients were out of reach. She needed food people could afford. Food that felt comforting after a long day. The recipes that came easiest were the ones she remembered from childhood. Grilled cheese sandwiches with perfectly crisp bread. Slow-cooked barbecue pulled pork. Homemade tomato soup. Nothing complicated. Just honest food made carefully. The first grocery trip nearly emptied her remaining cash. As she loaded supplies into the truck, anxiety followed every purchase. Bread, cheese, meat, condiments, paper trays, napkins. Every dollar mattered. Failure now had a price tag attached to it. Finally, opening day arrived. Rachel parked in a small lot near a busy industrial district just after sunrise. Delivery trucks rolled past. Construction crews gathered nearby. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from a convenience store across the street. She unlocked the serving window and waited. 1 hour passed. Then another. No customers came. By lunchtime, doubt settled heavily on her shoulders. She checked her phone repeatedly, even though nobody was calling. The food remained untouched. The parking lot remained indifferent. Then shortly after 1 o'clock, a man wearing a reflective safety vest approached the window. He studied the menu for several seconds before looking up. "Can I get a grilled cheese?" Rachel smiled nervously. "Absolutely." As she turned toward the grill, she had no idea that the simple sandwich she was about to serve would become the first step toward a future bigger than anything she had ever imagined. The grilled cheese took less than 5 minutes to make, but Rachel remembered every second of it. The butter hissed against the hot surface of the grill. The scent of toasted bread drifted through the serving window and out into the afternoon air. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped the sandwich and handed it over. The construction worker paid, thanked her, and walked away carrying a simple paper tray. Rachel watched him disappear across the parking lot. Then she looked down at the $5 bill resting in the cash box. $5. It was not much. Most people would not even notice it. But to Rachel, it felt like proof that maybe this impossible idea could actually work. The next few days were far less inspiring. Some mornings, she sold 3 sandwiches. Some days, she sold none. There were long stretches where she stood alone behind the serving window watching traffic move through the intersection. Delivery trucks came and went. Workers hurried past. Life moved around her while her food truck sat unnoticed beneath the sun. By the end of the first week, reality arrived with painful clarity. She was losing money. Gas cost more than she expected. Ingredients spoiled faster than she could sell them. Every evening, she counted receipts at the tiny table inside her motel room and felt her stomach tighten. One rainy Tuesday, she earned $17 during an entire 10-hour shift. $17. The number stared back at her from a crumpled receipt as rain tapped against the truck roof. She sat alone inside the dim kitchen, listening to water drums softly above her head. For several minutes, she simply stared through the windshield at the empty parking lot. The temptation to quit felt stronger than ever. Nobody would blame her. Most people would probably call the whole attempt admirable. She had tried. She had taken a chance. Sometimes things did not work out. Yet every time she imagined giving up, she pictured Emma and Caleb. Their faces lived inside every difficult decision she made. On Friday evenings, Brandon allowed a scheduled video call. Rachel waited for those calls the way some people waited for holidays. She would park the truck, clean the counters, brush her hair, and sit carefully beneath the soft interior light before pressing the answer button. Emma loved talking about school. Caleb loved explaining complicated stories that rarely made sense. Rachel listened to every word as if storing them away for safekeeping. One evening, Emma held up a drawing she had made in art class. It showed a bright red truck with oversized wheels and a smiling woman standing beside it. "That is you, Mom," Emma said proudly. Rachel felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "When can we visit?" Caleb asked suddenly. The question hung in the air. Rachel glanced away for a moment before forcing a smile. "Soon," she said gently. "I am working very hard so that can happen." After the call ended, she sat alone inside the truck for a long time. The silence felt heavier than usual. Outside, streetlights reflected against wet pavement. She opened the refrigerator and studied the ingredients she still had left. Enough for tomorrow. Maybe enough for Sunday. Beyond that, she was not sure. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and little improvement. Business remained slow. By noon, she had served only 2 customers. Then, shortly after 1 o'clock, a woman in her 20s approached the truck carrying a camera and a notebook. Rachel assumed she was looking for directions. Instead, the woman pointed toward the menu board. "I heard somebody at the job site mention your barbecue sandwich," she said. "Is it really that good?" Rachel laughed softly. "I hope so." The woman ordered lunch and sat at a nearby picnic table. 20 minutes later, she returned for a second sandwich. Before leaving, she introduced herself as Megan Harper. She explained that she wrote reviews for a small local food blog. Rachel thanked her politely, thinking little of it. After all, thousands of blogs existed online. One review could not possibly change anything. But later that night, as Rachel locked the serving window and prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with a notification she did not recognize. Then another, and another. Standing alone beneath the glow of a parking lot light, she stared at the screen as unfamiliar messages began appearing faster than she could read them. The notifications continued arriving all night. Rachel sat on the edge of her motel bed staring at her phone while the screen lit up again and again. New comments, new messages, new followers. At first she assumed there had been some kind of mistake. Then she found Megan Harper's review. The article was simple, honest, and surprisingly heartfelt. The headline read, "The best sandwich I found in a parking lot." Beneath it was a photo of Rachel standing beside the truck, smiling awkwardly beneath the serving window. Megan had written about the homemade tomato soup, the barbecue sandwich, and the woman behind it all. She described Rachel as someone who cooked like she genuinely cared whether strangers had a good day. Thousands of people had already shared the story. By sunrise, Rachel understood something had changed. Cars began pulling into the lot before she even opened. Construction workers returned with coworkers. Office employees drove across town during lunch breaks. Some customers arrived carrying screenshots of the article. Others simply wanted to see whether the food was really worth the attention. Rachel barely had time to think. The grill stayed busy from morning until late afternoon. Orders came faster than she could prepare them. For the first time since buying the truck, she ran out of bread before the day ended. She locked the serving window that evening feeling physically exhausted but strangely energized. Back at the motel, she spread receipts across the bed and counted the day's sales 3 separate times because she could not believe the numbers. It was more money than she had earned during her entire first week combined. Yet success brought new challenges. More customers meant longer hours, more ingredients, more expenses. Rachel woke before dawn every morning and often finished cleaning the truck long after sunset. Her hands became rough from constant work. The scent of grilled cheese, coffee, and barbecue smoke seemed permanently woven into her clothes. Still, she never complained. Every extra dollar felt like another brick in the foundation she was slowly building. The hardest moments still came at night. One evening she returned to her room, carrying a grocery bag full of supplies for the next day. Waiting beside the door was a small envelope. Her heart immediately recognized Emma's handwriting. Rachel hurried inside and carefully opened it. Folded within was a drawing. Emma had drawn the truck again. Only this time there were customers standing in line. Caleb appeared in the picture too, proudly holding a giant sandwich that was nearly larger than he was. Across the top, written in colorful letters, were 4 simple words. "We miss you, Mom." Rachel sat quietly on the edge of the bed, holding the drawing against her chest. Outside, traffic hummed along the highway. The motel air conditioner rattled softly in the corner. For a few minutes, the loneliness she worked so hard to outrun finally caught up with her. She missed school concerts, weekend breakfasts, bedtime stories. She missed hearing their footsteps down a hallway that no longer belonged to her. Success felt wonderful during the day, but at night, the empty spaces remained. The following Friday, during their scheduled video call, Emma excitedly told her that some classmates had seen the food truck online. Caleb insisted that his mother was becoming famous. Rachel laughed, shaking her head. "I am not famous," she said. "I just make sandwiches." "The best sandwiches," Caleb corrected confidently. Rachel smiled. For the rest of the evening, his words stayed with her. Maybe the truck was never really about food. Maybe it was about proving that broken things could still become something valuable. As she prepared for another long weekend, her phone vibrated again. This time it was not a customer message. It was an email from someone she had never heard of before. The subject line contained only 6 words. Invitation to the State Food Festival. Rachel read the email 3 times before she believed it was real. The State Food Festival was one of the largest annual events in the region. Hundreds of vendors applied every year. Thousands of visitors attended. Local television stations covered it. Food critics traveled from neighboring states to review new businesses. Rachel had visited once years earlier with Brandon and the children. Back then she had walked through the crowded rows of vendors, imagining what it would be like to own a business of her own. The memory felt distant now, almost belonging to another person. She sat alone inside the truck long after closing time, staring at the invitation glowing on her phone screen. Part of her wanted to say no immediately. The festival required a participation fee, additional permits, larger inventory purchases, more risk. Everything she had built so far still felt fragile. One bad decision could undo months of progress. Yet another voice inside her whispered that opportunities rarely arrived when people felt ready. The following morning, she called the number listed in the email. A cheerful coordinator explained that several reviewers had recommended her truck after reading Megan Harper's article and visiting in person. Rachel thanked her and promised to submit the paperwork by the end of the week. When the call ended, she sat quietly behind the steering wheel staring through the windshield. The old truck that once looked abandoned now seemed almost proud beneath the morning sunlight. The next 3 weeks became a blur of preparation. Rachel worked harder than she thought possible. She tested recipes late into the night. She compared ingredient costs. She redesigned the menu. She scrubbed every surface until the truck looked cleaner than it had in years. Walter continued helping whenever he could. Sometimes he repaired small mechanical problems. Sometimes he simply showed up with coffee and encouragement. One afternoon, he watched Rachel organize supplies inside the truck and shook his head with a smile. "You know what is funny?" he asked. Rachel glanced up. "What?" Walter leaned against the counter. "The first day you walked into that lot, you looked like somebody carrying the weight of the world." Rachel laughed softly. "That sounds accurate. Now look at you." She followed his gaze around the truck. Fresh paint covered the exterior. A new sign displayed the business name she had chosen weeks earlier. Carter's Kitchen. Simple, honest, familiar. For a moment, Rachel allowed herself to feel proud. Then her phone vibrated. A message from Emma appeared on the screen. It was a photograph from school. Emma stood beside a science project display with a giant grin across her face. Rachel immediately smiled. A second message followed from Caleb. It contained a blurry drawing of a food truck with enormous wheels and a note that simply read, "Good luck, Mom." Her chest tightened. No matter how busy life became, the distance between them remained the one problem she could not solve. The festival weekend arrived beneath clear blue skies. Rachel drove to the fairgrounds before sunrise. As she approached the entrance, rows of food trucks stretched across acres of pavement. Bright colors, professional branding, giant trailers equipped with equipment far more advanced than anything she owned. For a brief moment, insecurity returned. Compared to many of the businesses around her, Carter's Kitchen looked small, almost insignificant. She parked in her assigned space and began unloading supplies. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the cool morning air. Vendors hurried between booths carrying boxes and equipment. Music echoed faintly from speakers being tested near the main stage. By 10 o'clock, visitors flooded through the gates. Families pushed strollers. Teenagers gathered around dessert vendors. Food critics carried notebooks and cameras. Rachel barely had time to breathe. Orders arrived continuously. Grilled cheese sandwiches disappeared almost as quickly as she could prepare them. Customers returned for second orders. Others posted photos online. The line beside her truck grew longer throughout the afternoon. At one point, Rachel looked up from the grill and froze. Standing near the front of the line was a local television crew. A reporter spoke briefly with customers before approaching the serving window. Rachel immediately felt her pulse quicken. The reporter introduced herself and explained that they were highlighting standout vendors from the festival. Before Rachel fully understood what was happening, a camera was pointed toward her. Questions followed. How did the business start? What inspired the menu? What made Carter's Kitchen different? Rachel answered honestly. She spoke about hard work, community support, simple food prepared with care. She never mentioned Brandon, never discussed the divorce, never described the nights she cried alone in a motel room wondering whether she would fail. Some stories still belonged only to her. The interview lasted less than 10 minutes. Afterward, the crew thanked her and moved on. Rachel returned to work assuming nothing would come of it. The festival ended 2 days later. Exhausted but grateful, she drove home with stronger sales than she had ever imagined. For the first time since the divorce, she paid every outstanding bill without worrying about what remained in her bank account. It felt like breathing after being underwater for months. 3 days later, while preparing sandwiches for the lunch rush, her phone rang. Rachel nearly ignored it. The number was unfamiliar. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end belonged to a producer from a regional television program. As Rachel listened, her hands slowly tightened around the phone. Outside, Customers continued gathering near the truck. Inside, her future had just taken another unexpected turn. The producer introduced herself as Lisa Moreno, and her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who spent every day speaking to strangers. Rachel stood inside the truck with a spatula still in one hand while customers waited outside. For a moment, she wondered whether somebody was playing a joke. Lisa explained that their regional program featured small businesses with inspiring stories. The segment from the State Food Festival had generated an unusually strong response from viewers. People wanted to know more about Carter's Kitchen. They wanted to meet the woman behind the food. Rachel leaned against the counter and listened carefully. The producer invited her to participate in a longer feature scheduled for the following month. Cameras would visit the truck. They would film her daily routine. They would interview customers and document the story behind the business. Rachel thanked her, promised to think about it, and ended the call. Then she stood motionless for several seconds while the lunch rush continued outside. The old Rachel would have found reasons to decline. She would have worried about saying the wrong thing, looking foolish, failing publicly. But the past year had changed her. Every challenge she survived seemed to leave behind a little more confidence than before. That evening she called Walter. "They want to put me on television," she said. Silence followed. Then came a laugh so loud she had to pull the phone away from her ear. "I have been telling people for months they would figure it out eventually," Walter replied. Rachel smiled despite herself. "Figure what out?" "That you are impossible to stop." The television crew arrived 3 weeks later. The morning sun had barely risen when 2 vans pulled into the parking lot. Producers carried cameras, microphones, lights, and enough equipment to transform an ordinary workday into something that suddenly felt important. Rachel tried to focus on preparing ingredients, but every movement felt awkward beneath observation. The cameras followed her through the morning routine. They filmed her unlocking the truck. They filmed her setting up supplies. They filmed her greeting regular customers by name. At first, she worried about appearing natural. Then the lunch rush arrived, and there was no time left for self-consciousness. Orders came quickly. The familiar rhythm returned. Butter on the grill. Bread turning golden brown. Customers smiling as food crossed the serving window. By afternoon, Rachel almost forgot the cameras were there. During a break, one of the producers asked if she would be willing to discuss how the business began. Rachel looked through the serving window toward the distant traffic moving along the road. For a moment, she considered giving the easy version of the story, the simplified version. But something told her honesty mattered more. She spoke about loss, about starting over, about having almost nothing except determination and a truck that most people would have ignored. She talked about the people who helped her along the way. Walter, Megan Harper, loyal customers who returned when there was no guarantee she would succeed. Yet even then, she carefully avoided bitterness. There was no anger in her voice when she mentioned the divorce. No blame. No attempt to settle old scores. The cameras captured something far more powerful. A woman who refused to let hardship define her future. When filming finally ended, life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could. Rachel continued working 6 days a week. Sales remained strong. She moved out of the motel and rented a small apartment near the truck's primary location. It was not luxurious. The kitchen was tiny. The furniture barely matched, but every inch of it belonged to her. The first evening she unpacked boxes, she taped Emma's drawing to the refrigerator and placed Caleb's picture beside it. The apartment immediately felt like home. Weeks passed. The television segment aired on a Thursday evening. Rachel almost forgot it was happening until her phone exploded with messages shortly after 8 o'clock. Customers posted screenshots. Friends she had not spoken to in years reached out. Orders increased overnight. The next morning, a line stretched farther than she had ever seen before. Some people drove nearly 2 hours after watching the broadcast. Others arrived simply because they admired the story. Carter's Kitchen was no longer just a local food truck. It was becoming something larger, something people believed in. That Friday evening, Rachel sat in her apartment after another exhausting day. A cup of tea rested beside her on the table. Outside, city lights shimmered through the window. Her phone rang. This time it was Emma. Rachel answered immediately. "Mom," Emma said excitedly. "Everybody saw you on television." Rachel laughed. "Everybody. At least everybody I know." In the background, she could hear Caleb shouting that he wanted to talk next. The sound filled the apartment with warmth. For nearly an hour, they shared stories, jokes, and small details from their week. After the call ended, Rachel remained seated beside the window. The silence felt different now. Not lonely, peaceful. She looked out across the city and allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The road had been longer than anyone realized, harder than most people would ever know. Yet for the first time since walking out of that courthouse, she truly believed she was building a future instead of merely surviving the past. Then her email notification chimed. A new message appeared at the top of the screen. The sender was a national television network. Rachel stared at the email for nearly a full minute before opening it. The sender's logo sat at the top of the message, instantly recognizable. It belonged to one of the largest morning television programs in the country. She read the invitation once, then again, then a third time just to make certain she had not misunderstood. The producers wanted her to appear on a special segment highlighting entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses from almost nothing. Travel expenses would be covered. Filming would take place in New York. The segment would air nationally. Rachel slowly lowered her phone and looked around her small apartment. The refrigerator hummed softly. Emma's drawing still hung on the door. Caleb's picture sat nearby. Everything felt strangely quiet. A year earlier, she had been counting quarters to buy gas for the truck. Now a national television network wanted to tell her story. The contrast felt almost impossible to process. The following morning, she showed the email to Walter. The old mechanic adjusted his glasses and read it twice before letting out a low whistle. "Well," he said, handing the phone back. "Looks like they finally figured out what I already knew." Rachel laughed. "You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true." Yet beneath her excitement, another feeling lingered. Fear. Not the fear of hard work. She understood hard work. This was different. National television meant exposure. Attention. Questions. It meant stepping onto a much larger stage than anything she had ever imagined. That evening, she called Emma and Caleb. The reaction was immediate. Emma screamed so loudly Rachel had to hold the phone away from her ear. Caleb demanded to know whether famous athletes would be there. Rachel promised nothing except that she would do her best. Their excitement stayed with her long after the call ended. Over the next month, Carter's kitchen continued growing. Rachel hired her first employee, a college student named Olivia, who worked weekends. Then came a second employee. Demand had simply become too large for one person to manage alone. Customers lined up before opening hours. Corporate offices began requesting catering services. Local event organizers reached out regularly. Every week seemed to bring another opportunity. One rainy afternoon, Rachel sat reviewing invoices when a real estate agent showed her a vacant storefront available for lease. The building was modest. Large front windows faced a busy street. The kitchen needed upgrades. The walls required fresh paint. Most people would have seen an empty space. Rachel saw possibility. The thought frightened her. A restaurant was far more complicated than a truck. Higher costs, greater risk, more responsibility. Yet she recognized something familiar in that feeling. It was the same uncertainty she had felt while standing beside the abandoned truck months earlier. Growth rarely arrived disguised as comfort. 3 months later, the first Carter's Kitchen restaurant opened its doors. The grand opening exceeded every expectation. Customers filled every table. The scent of grilled sandwiches and homemade soup drifted through the dining room. Families gathered beneath warm lighting. Office workers arrived during lunch breaks. Children pointed excitedly toward photographs on the walls showing the original food truck. Rachel spent most of the day greeting customers and thanking people for their support. Late that evening, after the restaurant finally closed, she remained alone in the dining room. The chairs were stacked. The lights had been dimmed. Outside, rain glistened across the sidewalks. Rachel walked slowly between the empty tables. Her fingertips brushed lightly across polished wood surfaces. For several moments, she simply stood there absorbing the reality of what had happened. The room represented more than business success. It represented survival. Every setback, every rejection, every lonely night in the motel, every early morning beside the grill. They had all led here. A few days later, she boarded a plane for New York. It was her first flight in years. As the city skyline appeared beneath the aircraft window, Rachel felt the same mixture of excitement and nervousness she had carried throughout this entire journey. The television network arranged accommodations near the studio. Producers guided her through schedules and interviews. Everything moved quickly. Bright lights, busy hallways, people carrying headsets and clipboards. Yet despite the chaos, Rachel found herself surprisingly calm. She no longer felt like someone pretending to belong in important places. She had earned her seat at the table. The night before filming, she sat alone in her hotel room overlooking the city. Thousands of lights sparkled beyond the glass. Her phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Good luck tomorrow, Mom. We are proud of you." Rachel smiled and placed the phone against her heart for a moment. Then another message arrived. This one came from a producer. The filming schedule had changed slightly. During the broadcast, the host planned to reveal a surprise update about her business journey. Rachel frowned curiously. No further details were included. She set the phone down and looked out at the city once more. Somewhere beyond those buildings, tomorrow was already waiting. Morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and the distant hum of New York traffic. Rachel barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, another thought surfaced. Another question. Another reminder that millions of people might soon hear a story she had spent years quietly carrying. She stood beside the hotel window watching the city wake beneath her. Yellow taxis flowed through intersections. Steam drifted from street vents. Office workers hurried along sidewalks with coffee cups in hand. Everything moved with purpose. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt as though she was moving with it rather than chasing behind. The studio car arrived shortly after 7. As Manhattan passed outside the window, Rachel reviewed notes she had barely touched since arriving. The producers had assured her there were no wrong answers. They simply wanted her to be herself. Still, old habits lingered. For years she had worried about saying the wrong thing, looking foolish, taking up too much space. Success had given her confidence, but confidence was not the absence of nerves. It was learning how to move forward despite them. The studio lobby buzzed with energy. Hosts hurried between meetings. Production assistants carried equipment through long hallways. Large screens displayed live broadcasts from around the country. Rachel followed a producer toward the green room, where makeup artists and wardrobe coordinators prepared guests for the show. Everything felt larger than life, yet strangely familiar. The same lesson kept repeating throughout her journey. Every intimidating place eventually became just another room filled with people trying to do their jobs. An hour later, she found herself seated across from the host beneath bright studio lights. Cameras surrounded them. Crew members counted down quietly from behind monitors. The audience applauded as the segment began. The host greeted viewers and introduced Rachel as the founder of Carter's Kitchen. Photographs appeared on large screens behind them. The original food truck. The first crowded lunch line. The small restaurant opening. The audience reacted warmly to each image. Rachel answered questions honestly. She spoke about perseverance, community, starting over. The host asked how she found the courage to keep going when everything seemed impossible. Rachel paused briefly. Then she smiled. "I stopped asking whether I was guaranteed success," she said. "I started asking whether I could live with myself if I never tried." The audience applauded. Somewhere back home, customers, friends, and strangers watched from living rooms and office break rooms. Rachel could almost feel it. Yet one thing surprised her most. The conversation no longer felt like an interview. It felt like a reflection, a chance to understand how far she had actually traveled. The host eventually leaned forward and smiled knowingly. "There is something we have not told you yet," he said. Rachel immediately remembered the producer's mysterious message. The audience seemed to sense a surprise approaching. Curious murmurs spread through the studio. The host gestured toward one of the large screens. "Over the past several weeks, our team has been speaking with people connected to your journey." Rachel frowned slightly. The screen flickered to life. Walter appeared first. Standing beside the original truck, he spoke warmly about the day a determined woman walked into a forgotten industrial lot carrying only hope and $300. The audience laughed as he described her stubborn refusal to quit. Next came Megan Harper. She described discovering Carter's Kitchen during those difficult early months and why she believed readers connected so deeply with Rachel's story. Several longtime customers followed. One construction worker smiled as he explained that he still remembered buying the very first sandwich. Rachel laughed through tears she could no longer hide. Then the screen changed again. This time Emma appeared. Rachel's breath caught instantly. Her daughter sat beside Caleb in what looked like their living room. Both children wore nervous smiles. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Emma looked directly into the camera. "Mom, we know you work really hard." Caleb nodded enthusiastically beside her. "Really hard. Emma continued. Sometimes people think success is becoming famous or making money. But when we talk about you at school, that is not what makes us proud. Rachel pressed a hand gently against her mouth. The audience had fallen completely silent. Emma smiled. We are proud because when things got hard, you never gave up. Caleb leaned closer to the camera. And your grilled cheese is awesome. Laughter rippled through the audience. Rachel laughed too, tears shining in her eyes. The video ended. For a moment she could not speak. The host gave her time. Across the studio, audience members wiped at their own eyes. Finally Rachel found her voice. Those two are the reason for everything, she said softly. Every single thing. The applause that followed felt different from any applause she had ever heard. Not louder, warmer, more personal. As the segment continued, Rachel believed the surprise was over. She had no idea that back home, in a suburban living room hundreds of miles away, someone she had not spoken to in years had just frozen in front of a television screen, staring at her face as the program reached its final minutes. Brandon Carter had not planned to watch morning television that day. The program had simply been playing in the background while he answered emails from home. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the table beside him. Rain drifted softly across the living room windows. His attention had been elsewhere until he heard a familiar name. Rachel. At first he thought it must be someone else. Then her face appeared on the screen. Everything after that became impossible to ignore. He sat motionless as the interview unfolded. The woman speaking beneath the bright studio lights looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The Rachel he remembered had always seemed cautious, careful, quiet. This version carried herself differently. Her words came easily. Her smile looked genuine. There was no trace of the uncertainty he once associated with her. As photographs flashed across the screen, Brandon felt a strange mixture of disbelief and confusion. He recognized the food truck. He recognized the name Carter's Kitchen. Over the years, he had occasionally heard bits and pieces from Emma and Caleb. They talked about their mother's business, customers, festivals, interviews. He had listened politely, but never paid much attention. He assumed it was a small operation, a hobby that happened to earn money, nothing more. Now he realized how wrong he had been. The audience applauded as Rachel described her journey. She never complained, never blamed anyone. She did not mention the divorce. She did not mention losing the house. She did not mention the nights she spent struggling alone. Instead, she spoke about opportunity, gratitude, and perseverance. Somehow that made the story even more powerful. Brandon stared at the screen. He remembered the courthouse. He remembered convincing himself that Rachel would eventually need help, that she would struggle without the stability he believed he provided. He remembered assuming she would settle into a smaller life, a quieter life, a life built around limitations. Instead, she had built something extraordinary. Across the room, his phone began vibrating repeatedly. Friends had seen the broadcast. Business associates had seen it too. Messages appeared one after another. Is that your ex-wife? I had no idea she owned that company. Incredible story. Brandon ignored them all. He kept watching. Then came the video from Emma and Caleb. As their faces appeared on screen, something inside him shifted. The children looked older now than he sometimes realized. Emma carried herself with confidence. Caleb's smile still contained the same enthusiasm he had as a child, but there was maturity there too. They spoke about their mother with unmistakable pride. Brandon listened carefully. Every word landed harder than he expected. Not because Rachel was successful. Success alone was easy to admire from a distance. What unsettled him was the realization that the children saw her as a symbol of resilience. A role model. Someone who had transformed hardship into something meaningful. He wondered how many moments he had missed while focusing on practical details and daily responsibilities. The segment ended, but Brandon remained seated long afterward. The television moved on to weather reports and celebrity interviews. He barely noticed. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Rachel sitting at the kitchen table sketching ideas in a notebook years ago. Rachel talking excitedly about opening a small cafe before life became complicated. Rachel laughing with the children at the beach. Small moments he had not thought about in years. For the first time, he began to understand that the story shown on television had not started with a food truck. It had started long before that. It had started with a woman whose potential he never fully recognized. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Rachel stepped out of the studio into crisp New York air. The city felt brighter somehow. Producers thanked her. Audience members stopped her for photographs. Strangers approached to share their own stories of starting over. She accepted every kind word with humility, but her thoughts kept returning to Emma and Caleb. Their message replayed in her mind throughout the afternoon. That evening, she boarded a flight home. As the plane climbed above the clouds, she looked out the window at the fading skyline. Success had brought recognition, opportunities, growth. Yet none of those things compared to hearing her children say they were proud of her. The plane continued west through the darkening sky. Rachel closed her eyes and smiled softly. She believed the biggest surprises of her journey were finally behind her. She could not have been more mistaken. Waiting inside her inbox was a message that would change everything once again. Rachel arrived home just after midnight. The airport was quieter than usual, the crowds thinner, the fluorescent lights softer against the polished floors. By the time she unlocked the door to her apartment, exhaustion settled heavily into her shoulders. The past several days felt almost unreal. Television studios, interviews, cameras, applause. Yet the familiar sight of Emma's drawing on the refrigerator instantly grounded her again. She placed her suitcase beside the couch, changed into comfortable clothes, and finally sat down with her laptop. The unread email waiting in her inbox came from a national business publication. At first, Rachel assumed it was another interview request. Over the past few months, those had become increasingly common. But as she opened the message, her eyebrows slowly lifted. The publication was releasing its annual list of America's most promising small businesses. Carter's Kitchen had been selected as one of the featured companies. Rachel leaned back in her chair and reread the email carefully. The article highlighted businesses demonstrating exceptional growth, community impact, and long-term potential. The recognition alone felt significant. Then she noticed the publication date. The feature would appear online the following week. Millions of readers would see it. Across town, Brandon could not stop thinking about the television interview. Days passed, yet Rachel's story lingered in his mind with surprising persistence. At work, colleagues mentioned the broadcast. Friends shared articles online. Even Emma and Caleb continued talking about it during dinner. The more he heard, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Brandon found himself searching for Carter's Kitchen online. What he discovered left him stunned. There were articles, reviews, interviews, customer testimonials, social media pages filled with photographs from the restaurant and food truck. Thousands of comments praised Rachel not only for her food, but for her story. He scrolled through images of crowded dining rooms and smiling customers. Then he found a photograph of Rachel standing beside the original truck. She was laughing at something outside the frame. The expression looked completely natural, completely free. Brandon stared at the image longer than he intended. Somewhere along the way, she had become someone he no longer fully knew. Meanwhile, Rachel's life continued accelerating. The business publication released its feature exactly as promised. Within hours, traffic to Carter's Kitchen exploded. New customers arrived daily. Franchise inquiries began appearing in her inbox. Investors reached out with partnership proposals. The restaurant remained busy from opening until closing. The original food truck, once abandoned behind a chain-link fence, had become something of a local landmark. One afternoon, while reviewing paperwork at the restaurant, Rachel received another unexpected call. This time it came from the board of a statewide entrepreneurship organization. They wanted to honor her during an upcoming awards gala recognizing business leaders and community contributors. Rachel nearly laughed at the idea, not because she was ungrateful, but because the word gala still sounded like it belonged to someone else's life. Yet the invitation was genuine. As she hung up the phone, Olivia looked up from the counter and grinned. "You know your calendar is becoming impossible, right?" Rachel smiled. "I remember when my biggest concern was selling one sandwich." Olivia laughed. "Those days are definitely over." That evening, after the restaurant closed, Rachel walked outside and stood beside the original truck. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. Customers still occasionally stopped to take photographs beside it. Children pointed at it through car windows. Rachel ran her hand lightly along the side panel. The metal felt warm from the day's heat. It was strange how quickly life could change. Yet for all the success, the awards, and the recognition, the things she valued most remained remarkably simple. Emma's drawings, Caleb's phone calls, A restaurant filled with people sharing meals. A second chance she almost never took. Her phone vibrated. A new message appeared from Emma. "Mom, guess what?" Rachel smiled and opened it, unaware that the conversation about to follow would lead to the most meaningful moment of her entire journey. "Mom, guess what?" Rachel smiled as she opened the message. Attached was a photograph of Emma standing beside a display board at school. The title across the top read, "My Hero." Rachel's smile faded into stunned silence as she looked closer. The board was covered with photographs. The food truck, the restaurant, a screenshot from the television interview. There were handwritten notes arranged around the images. Rachel enlarged the photo and read each one carefully. "She is brave. She works hard. She helps people. She never gave up." Rachel blinked rapidly as emotion tightened her throat. A second message appeared. This one came directly from Emma. "We had to choose someone who inspires us. I picked you." For several moments, Rachel simply sat there staring at the screen. The restaurant around her had grown quiet. Employees finished closing duties in the background. Dishes clinked softly in the kitchen. Outside, evening sunlight faded across the parking lot. Yet all Rachel could see were those 4 words. "I picked you." A video call request appeared seconds later. Rachel answered immediately. Emma's smiling face filled the screen. Caleb leaned into view from the side, nearly knocking the camera over. "Did you see it?" Emma asked excitedly. Rachel nodded, unable to trust her voice right away. "I did." Caleb grinned. "She won first place." Rachel laughed through tears. "She did." Emma rolled her eyes playfully. "Caleb was more excited than I was." "Not true," he protested. "Mostly not true." The conversation drifted naturally after that. School stories, upcoming projects, small details from everyday life. The kind of ordinary moments Rachel treasured more than any award or interview. Then Emma grew unexpectedly quiet. "Mom." Rachel looked up. "Yes." Emma hesitated. "When I was younger, I thought losing things meant you failed." Rachel listened carefully. "But now I think maybe sometimes losing things is how people find out who they really are." The words settled gently between them. Simple, honest, wise beyond her years. Rachel felt her eyes fill again. "That might be the smartest thing I have heard all year," she said softly. Emma smiled. Caleb immediately objected. "I say smart things too." Laughter filled the call, warm and effortless. After they said goodnight, Rachel remained seated in the quiet restaurant. The phone rested in her hands. Outside, darkness settled across the city. Awards would come and go. Headlines would fade. Television appearances would eventually end. But nothing would ever matter more than knowing her children saw her not as someone who succeeded, but as someone who kept going. And for the first time since walking out of that courthouse years earlier, Rachel realized she no longer felt like she had lost anything at all. 6 months later, the original food truck still stood beside the restaurant, preserved exactly as it had been on the day everything changed. Customers often stopped to take photographs beside it. Some knew the story. Others simply liked the food. Rachel never corrected either reason. On a cool autumn evening, she locked the restaurant doors after closing and stepped outside. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Streetlights cast a warm glow across the parking lot. Inside, employees finished cleaning. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace. Rachel walked slowly toward the truck and rested her hand against the familiar metal. The paint was newer now, the logo brighter, but underneath it all remained the same vehicle she had purchased with her last $300. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She remembered the courthouse, the motel room, the empty parking lot, the days when $17 felt like survival. She remembered wondering whether she was making the biggest mistake of her life. A car pulled into the lot. Rachel opened her eyes and watched as Emma and Caleb stepped out, waving enthusiastically. Their laughter carried through the evening air. Rachel smiled and walked toward them. Nothing in her life had ever sounded more beautiful. Across town, Brandon occasionally saw articles about Carter's kitchen. Sometimes he drove past the restaurant. Sometimes he simply watched from a distance as the business continued growing. There was no dramatic confrontation, no bitter argument, no moment of revenge. Life rarely worked that way. Instead, there was something quieter, understanding, the realization that success had never been the point. Rachel had not rebuilt her life to prove anyone wrong. She had rebuilt it because she refused to stop believing that a better future was possible. standing beside her children beneath the restaurant lights. Rachel looked back once more at the truck that started everything. Years earlier, she had believed she lost her home, her security, and her future. What she eventually discovered was something far more valuable: courage, purpose, herself. The world saw a successful entrepreneur. Her children saw a hero. And somewhere between those two truths lived the woman who had learned that starting over was never the end of her story. It was the beginning.